Well, the Tigers season is almost to a finish with just about 10 games left in this season, and they currently stand at a 60-92 record. Underwhelming considering the expectations for the Tigers this season. Joining us to talk about the Tigers, their current season as well as their future, looking a little bit brighter in the last week or so, is Lynn Henning, a longtime columnist from the Detroit News and a freelance baseball writer as well. Lynn, thanks for being with us.
Hi, Tyler. Good to be with you this morning as well.
Yeah, good to have you on with us. So the Tigers, a very disappointing season to say the least. A lot of expectations for this team to make that next step coming into the season. The organization, some of the higher level people in the organization, including owner Chris Ilitch and then GM Al Avila, had said, rebuild is over. We're ready to start winning. This team is set and ready to go. And I think the expectations, not only from the pundits, but from within the organization, were much higher for this year. And it's a little bit of a broad question, but what do you believe went wrong and led to this performance in 2022 from the Tigers?
A combination of things. They weren't really as strong with the roster as I think we wanted to probably analyze. When you looked at Jamer Candelario and Jonathan Scope and Tucker Barnhart rather, and some of those people, we thought they had probably reconditioned their lineup together with Javier Baez to where last year's breakthrough season was going to be enhanced this year by something closer to 500 ball. But those guys didn't really do it. Baez is finally catching fire in September, and that's good because you're going to need him for a long time now. But that coupled with the fact that they began to lose players from the rotation, from the regular lineup, even before they broke camp in Florida, I've never seen a year so bizarre, so sadistic, so catastrophic in terms of injuries. You couldn't really overcome those two realities. And ultimately, it came down, in my estimation, to the one thing that's plagued them for years, and that is they had not accrued enough talent through the draft and through international signings to really give that roster a chance to have any real structural steel to it. And that's what's betrayed them, and that's what's led to the front office change.
And that's an interesting point, too, because at the end of the Dave Dombrowski era, where the Tigers had thrived for so many years, they were contending in the AL Central. They were getting to the ALCS, getting to the World Series. Didn't win anything. They won the pennant a couple times, but they didn't win the World Series in that run. But in doing so, they got so much talent loaded on that team that it really did deplete the farm system. And it had to have been expected as Dombrowski went out the door and Vila went into the big chair that it was going to be several years to get this team back in a decent spot. Now you look at their rookies, you look at their farm system, led, of course, by Riley Green and Spencer Torkelson, but also promising young guys. Kerry Carpenter had a nice showing up this season. Same thing with Ryan Kreidler. And some promising players down in the farm system. How far away do you think this Tigers team is from those young players really having a significant impact on this team, especially now that there's this frustration after those expectations weren't fulfilled?
I think it's more likely that next year you'll see the season that they figured they were going to get in 2022, which would indicate that it's going to be something closer to 500, which isn't going to get you into the playoffs, but it moves you at least in that direction. Then in 2024, they're going to have a whole new bunch of infielders that are going to arrive. Jace Young and Colt Kieft, and pay attention to those names particularly because I think they're going to be foundational in the same way that Green and Torkelson are now. And so you're going to have this steady infusion, and they've also got some very good young pitching down there too. And you'll start to see some of that bubble up next year as well when they get some other people healthy. I think they're going to have such a surplus of good arms next year, and you never say that much about pitching, but in this instance, you're going to have so many people returning. Spencer Turnbull and Skubal eventually will be healthy and probably back. And then you're going to have Joey Wentz to this current group. And by trade deadline next July, I think they're going to be in position to make some very heavy trades. And that's where I think it's going to get exciting for their new front office general here in Scott Harris, because he's going to have trade chips by the middle of next season, something that Al Avila rarely had.
And you mentioned Scott Harris, hired in as the GM of the Tigers. Previously had, so as the president of baseball operations for the Tigers.
Yeah.
Previously was the GM of the San Francisco Giants. Before that, he had worked in Chicago under the tutelage of Theo Epstein, who of course led the Chicago Cubs front office to a World Series championship, and before that, the Boston Red Sox as well. And so Scott Harris, one of the younger guys to be taking over that kind of a role in Major League Baseball. What about him attracted the Tigers to hire him to take over baseball operations and lead this team into the future?
He has a decade of experience, as you say, with very good front offices in pretty high level positions, and that coupled with the fact that he's got more degrees than a hot summer day. I mean, this guy's got degrees in econ and in business management from Northwestern. He's been to Columbia. He's been to the London School of Economics. Now, diplomas alone do not equip you to be a front office general, but when you factor that into the experience he's gotten with good GMs at good places, that tells you that a guy 35, 36 is in position now to be the kind of person that maybe Epstein was, or maybe Andrew Friedman has proven to be with the Dodgers, or Mike Elias over with the Orioles now, who've had their resurgence because of bright young people who know how to handle this business called roster assembly. So I think Harris is equipped really at this point to be a very, very strong and bright GM. And that's really what I thought the Tigers, I was going to say Lions, they kind of went that route already with Brad Holmes. But I always thought the Tigers needed to establish their own Theo Epstein, their own Andrew Friedman. Don't just go and try to poach someone else's person. Develop your own so that becomes an industry standard. And I think they have a chance with Harris to have done just that.
We're joined by Lynn Henning. He's a Detroit Tigers freelance, Detroit Tigers beat writer. He was for.
Well, actually, I can clarify. I actually retired, Tyler, 3.5 years ago, but I still do a lot of part-time baseball and even a little football and some other stuff for the Detroit News. So it's what you might call post-retirement, but still pretty active. So that kind of fills the blanks.
Yes, we're joined by Lynn Henning on today's edition of the Megacast. The Tigers again, 60-92 on the season as it stands. And you mentioned earlier, Lynn, the veterans on this team, there's some key decisions to make. Miguel Cabrera has already said he plans on coming back next season to play out the final year of his contract, doesn't intend to retire at the end of this season. But then you have other guys down the line, too, that have had somewhat of an impact on this team over the last couple of years, this year especially, maybe more of a detrimental impact. Guys like Jeimer Candelario and Jonathan Scope in particular. Where do you see their future, if any, with the Detroit Tigers? And where do you see the front office, particularly the ownership and the PBO's relationship being in terms of spending that kind of money in free agency that can often fill in some of those gaps and help support these young guys coming up and boost their talent?
Yeah, that's really the key, the latter point. In order, though, I would go with, I think Cabrera, yes, while he said a day after he said he might be open to retirement that he was going to play, that told you his agent had been on the phone with him in the preceding 24 hours. I think he will come to an agreement with the Tigers along with the doctors and his agent that Miguel Cabrera is likely to forego 2023. The Tigers will satisfy his contract, of course, but Miguel Cabrera understands he can't compete at the level anymore, nearing age 40, that would really make it beneficial for him or the Tigers for him to go through the 2023 season. I think that will be amicably resolved. Jeimer Candelario, I don't think will be tendered. He will not be offered a contract. Jonathan Scope will be open to replacement. The Tigers really should not have spent a 2-year contract on him. People liked it at the time. I thought it was risky at the time. It was risky. It is risky. It is going to end up blowing up on them. So I think the new GM, Tyler, has big thoughts about who can produce and who can't. And that's why you hire a guy like that, because you're going to have to make some non-sentimental calls. You're going to have to eat some money. But those are hard decisions. And if you don't make hard decisions, you're just going to have a continuation of these times, and no one wants that. But back to the money, if you notice, the Cleveland Indians are going to be in the playoffs for the fifth time in the last 7 years. Lowest payroll among the lowest in baseball. It's not about payroll. It's as you say, you want to augment a current cast of structural essential pieces that have come up through your farm system with complementary help that you can get from free agency. The Tigers went out and spent $240 million last offseason to get players, and everybody loved it. They thought checkbook roster assembly was back in town and the Tigers are going to be great. Well, you've seen what that produces. It's by no means an answer. The answer is at the other end. The answer is at the front door with Green and Torkelson and the guys that we've mentioned. When you get those people in place, then you add the additional parts that round out your roster. But it is a case where people who think this is all indexed to payroll are looking at it upside down.
I'm joined by Lynn Henning on today's edition of the Megacast. Lynn, previously in your career, you mentioned you had also covered football, and you still do on a freelance basis cover football. Earlier on in your career, you covered my alma mater, Michigan State, and their football team. Last couple weeks with that team have been downright disgusting, to be entirely honest. It looks like their defense continues to have no idea what's going on in the secondary. And it seems at times that when they get under the gun, when they are back with their backs against the wall, that some of these guys seem to be just giving up. What is going on with this Michigan State football team, and what are their next steps? Because they're in the middle of the season. Mel Tucker's the defensive coach. Scotty Hazelton, who are you going to replace him with if you get rid of him? What does Michigan State do?
They scotch taped up very nicely last year and had every break in the book. And that was quite the smoke and mirrors job by Tucker and company. This year, it's not a case, I would disagree with you, Tyler, that players are indifferent or that coaches aren't doing a good job. They don't have the horsepower on their roster to compete with good football teams. And you saw that Saturday, even from Minnesota, which is not to be confused with Ohio State. Michigan State is getting exposed. And the only way that you get around that is with good recruiting classes. And Mel Tucker is really only into his, second full season, you might say, of personnel recruitment. Next year's class is going to be very, very good as long as they hang on to these current pledges. And he will build even on that. So you won't see Mel Tucker really become Mel Tucker, I don't think, until about 2 years from now. And that's a long time. What they have to try to do, salvage this year, which is going to be very difficult. Their schedule and this kind of physical imbalance is not a good mix. But within 2 years, you're going to have his recruiting classes showing up, and they will get progressively better. I know people don't like to wait. They want instant gratification, but it's not Scotty Hazelton, who's the same defensive coordinator they had last year. I always find that amusing that fans like to focus on assistant coaches. They did so when D'Antonio's offense was very bad a few years ago. Yeah. But invariably, it's the same guys who coached other people and had success. It depends on the players, and always depends on the players. It's a little bit equivalent to the situation with the Tigers, where everybody wanted to fire Scott Coolbaugh, the hitting coach this year. He's now about the 80th hitting coach that I've seen in my life who was made responsible for the fact that hitters weren't hitting. And it always ends up being the guy swinging the bat, and it ends up being the guys on Spartan Stadium's turf that determine really your win-loss record. Coaching can improve matters, but it's not going to be responsible for the kind of chasm that you see now between Michigan State's physical potential and those of the opponents.
It's going to be an interesting remainder of the season for Michigan State, see how they can improve and try to compete with some of the tougher teams now that are in the thick of their Big Ten schedule. And of course, then comes the tougher task of retaining those recruits when the season isn't quite as exciting as you expected. Lynn, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, Tyler, enjoyed the conversation.